My name's Sylvana Carrick and I work for Ecolab, and I'm the connectivity coordinator, but I'm responsible for the legacy Nalco part of the business in Europe. And I'm the single point of contact for any requests from our customers for electronic transactions, whether that's receipt of purchase orders, of sending electronic invoices. And the idea being that that request gets sent to me. I look at the requests, look at the size of the customer, the profitability of the customer, and when I've done that analysis, that passes on up to my manager, and we see whether or not we can fulfill the request. Currently, as a rule, it's only our key account customers that we do this for. The odd exception is where a customer insists that it's mandatory for suppliers to do the electronic transaction.
And I mean, obviously, when we talk about e-invoicing, we talk about it from a receiver point of view, and you actually talk about it from a sender point of view.
Yes.
Can you share some great advice from your perspective on working with an e-invoicing project? What's your experience?
Predominantly, we have one connection with a third-party service provider where we were sending electronic invoices. However, when our company Nalco became part of Ecolab, we realised that we had an overlapping group of customers who all wanted to use this service provider, but because Ecolab had grown by acquisitions, there were multiple ERP systems, so we had a mismatch of some integrated with EDIFACT files, a lot was manual processing. So the decision was made that with the two legacy companies, there was enough customers to look at renegotiating a contract with the service provider. Up to that point, Nalco had a separate contract for each legal entity, and it was quite expensive, so we only added customers. We had a threshold where we would add them. Below that threshold, it was just not cost effective. But with the combined company, it gave us better bargaining tools, so we generated a new contract. But when we looked at that, the IT programmers wanted to review, and it was decided that we would have a new file format. So I looked after the legacy Nalco part of the project, and our current file was not brilliant. It had a lot of the business transactions it hadn't been programmed for, although we had tickets in to make changes, the volume of invoices meant it was really low priority. So, you know, they sort of sat there in the queue. So when we had this new file, I took the opportunity of saying, hey, I've got to do a new file. I will make sure all these issues we have are addressed at the time to improve that file. So hopefully the file covered all our business transactions, all our credits, so that when we sent them invoices, we had very few failures. That was, you'll never get rid of all failures, because obviously there's always people make mistakes. So that was the key aim of the project, but that project was very much our key account customer driven. It was as a result of their requests to do electronic invoicing, and because of the value of that business, it was deemed important that we met those customer needs.
And you have some very concrete advice you can give to those from your end, or perhaps also from the customer end, of some things when doing a project like this. Could you share those?
I sort of summarised it into sort of 10 tips, and the first tip was like, this is not just an IT programmer project. It involves many teams across the company, and obviously we're a very large global company, and those teams aren't necessarily all based in the same place. And right at the beginning of the project, you need to identify who needs to be involved, and very many diverse departments need to be involved. So if it is via a service provider, you need procurement and finance, because obviously the initial contract needs to be negotiated. And then you go around, master data is absolutely critical. My favourite saying is, a person can read a paper invoice, but a machine is giving guidelines. And if you don't meet those guidelines, it can't rationalise or decipher them. So if your master data is in a mess, electronic invoicing will be difficult. The other teams that are involved, obviously, you may need to liaise with the customer, although if they're using a service provider, often it's through that. If you are using a service provider, make sure they assign a project manager at their end, and if you're not happy with that project manager, change them. We had that in our project. 3 months went by and absolutely nothing had happened. And we said, hey, this is no good. And they gave us somebody more experienced, which was, you know, so much better. You need your administrators. They're the people doing the task on the day-to-day basis. You need ERP support, somebody who understands your ERP system. Obviously, your programmers. And then you've got, at the end of it, you've got accounts receivable, because instead of ringing the customer, they may have to go onto a web portal for the status. So a lot of people involved, and not major changes to their processes, but some changes that you've got to implement. So then I sort of went on from there and said, right, it's invoicing. Mandatory legal requirements from countries. Naively, I thought, well, if our paper invoices are fine, there'll be no problem with our electronic invoices. Not necessarily the case, because in our SAP system, you had to generate an electronic file, and not all the information that was on our paper invoice was in our electronic file. So the mandatory data, so you need, before you even start, make sure you have an update list of what all those legal requirements are currently in those countries. Then the tip 3 was buyer validation. Because we already had an existing system that we were changing, I had 1 or 2 customers who have very detailed requirements, and if I was to start this project afresh, I would say all the key points on your paper invoice should be in your file from the word go. If you're unfortunate, you start with a customer who may have simple requirements and say, we want product name, unit of measure, price and PO number, and that is it. When you then have to add something else, changing the programming sometimes causes other issues, which can, then you find you've got a live system which isn't working properly because you've made changes. So I would say from the beginning, include as much as you possibly can. Then when you've got all that information, you've got your buyer's request, you've got your legal request, then you need to look at your master data. Is it up to date? You'll find now we have strict requirements of the information on our master data, but customers who've had for a long time, their system may not have been updated ever, you know, and it may be missing key information that's important. And one thing we found is that when you're sending paper invoices, your legal entity names for some countries may not be quite correct. Germany will pull your invoices up. UK probably wouldn't. And for an example, we had a customer we'd had for 5 years. They'd been paying our paper invoices. We went electronic. We had 2 contracts. 1 invoice passed, 1 failed. Hey, what's wrong here? And we were delivering to 2 different parts of a company's site. Same site, but 2 different legal entities. And with the service provider, that meant 2 different account numbers. So that's another thing. One thing I do now is I go and check all the customers that we have, and then if possible I go to that customer and say, hey, these are the sites we deliver to, this is what I think your provider account number is going to be, please could you confirm? And believe it or not, that is incredibly difficult. Some customers are very good, some you get no response. It is a one-off error, but it is nice not to have that one-off error in the first place. So make sure your master data is up to date, especially your bill to addresses and your payer addresses. That's pretty critical. The other issue is to make sure that your buyers have your correct legal information. And I have an example of one customer we were putting on, and the customer came back to me and I said, yes, we'll happily do e-invoicing. And they came back and said, which of these vendors should we use? And none of them were our current legal entity. One of them was just a local district office address, which should never have been used, but probably was historical many, many years ago. So, you know, that's important as well, that they have the correct information for you. And then finally, for master data, then your ERP support and your IT programmers need to decide where that identifying information is going to be stored and which fields are available to store it on. And then from there, then you have got all that information together. Then you need to check, this is all on our printed invoice, is it also in our in-house file or your iDoc? And then before you even start programming, you need to make sure all the fields you want on that electronic invoice are present in your iDoc. And it's good to try and do that before you start programming. And then obviously you've got to program, and then you need your order to cash people involved, your ERP support, and your programmers to make sure that all your billing transactions, all your ways of crediting an invoice are covered, and that each member of that team understands, you know, what drives that, what in your system determines the billing transaction, where that information appears in the iDoc, and how you want that programmer to present that on the invoice. For example, we have fixed contracts where the customer, we agree an annual deal and we invoice them the same amount each month. On our paper invoices, that is a summary. When we went to electronic invoicing, it generated our internal breakdown as 5 lines, which wasn't suitable. So we had to say to the programmer, if it's this type of billing transaction, we want the line item numbers displayed, but if it's this other type of billing contract, we actually don't want all the line items displayed. It is a one-off monthly contract invoice. And so there's a lot of negotiation that everybody understands why we're doing it that way. Then obviously once they've written the program, you test, and you test everything in every legal entity. It is no good saying, right, we've tested for the UK, so it'll be fine for France, Germany, etc. Not necessarily so. And the provider wanted to program, and also the service provider wanted the same person doing that programming. So that's a question to ask. You know, when they say how long, they give you an idea of the programming time, you need to say, right, that's for one country, how much longer to take if you've got 10 countries to add. We had 13 legal entities, so instead of the 10 working days that they said to do a program, you had to multiply that by 13. It wasn't quite that long, but that sort of thing. And then you test as much as you possibly can and as thoroughly as you can. And then once you're ready to go live, you need to think about monitoring. How have you got a process in place to determine, have you sent the file, or is it stuck in the system somewhere? Has your service provider received the file? And then if they have received the file, you need to be notified on a daily basis of whether that file has passed the buyer validation or not. And you need processes in place to deal with failures at any one of those points. And then the final thing is to train up the relevant departments of any changes that means in their daily tasks, because that customer has electronic invoicing. For example, people who place orders on the system, we found PO field is our probably commonest reason for failing. And, you know, please don't add letters PO, please don't add a date, and because in some countries that is the norm. So it's changing the process for a very small percentage of customers. And so we give training and we provide a pop-up message to help people be aware of those things. Master data obviously need a process for those customers because the setup is slightly different. And the invoice dispute team need to also be aware. And finally, accounts receivable, because in our particular case, some of the customers no longer take phone calls to chase invoice. They say go onto the web portal to check the status. So training people for us is quite important, because it is still a small percentage of invoices that are sent this way. So it is the exception to the rule. Okay, so that was the sort of key points I wanted to highlight.
I mean, it sounds very complex, and the benefits for the customers are quite obvious, but have you seen any benefits? Have you been able to better, for instance, better forecasting and cash updates and follow-up?
Yeah, for us, the key benefit for electronic invoicing is knowing that the customer has received the invoice. You have absolute proof, whereas in a paper invoice they can tell you, I asked our accounts receivable, how, you know, do you have a rough percentage of how often you have to resend a paper invoice to a customer? And it's a significant percentage. And when you've got accounts receivable chasing, they can't resend the invoice, so they have to email somebody to generate the invoice for them. They then send it back to accounts receivable, who then send it to the customer. And when you're doing it electronically, you've got definitive proof that that customer has had that invoice. The customer gets the invoice more quickly. So for us, we will be looking at daily sales outstanding, because you know the customer's got the invoice, so they should be paying on time. Some errors, like incorrect partners or purchase order, we know immediately that that invoice has failed. It doesn't even get to the customer. So we can correct our invoice queries very, very early on in the chain. And so one of the things we would be looking at, and I think you have to wait some months to do it, is to see for those customers, if we look back over the years, whether our daily sales outstanding decreases for those customers. One of the contraindications, we tend to find that if customers have terms of about 30 days, you can see quite a dramatic improvement. But in some countries where the terms are 60, 70, 80 days, I think it's unlikely, even though you're sending invoices electronically, that you will see an improvement in DSO. But that's for us, it's customer driven rather than us driving it, because it is an accounts receivable thing. So we're the supplier, we're being requested to do it.
Well, it's a very important view, and thank you very much, and good luck with future projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.